The man tied to the iron post in the basement of an abandoned house in Curtis Bay had gone 3 days without a drop of water, and the person who found him was not one of the 40 armed men sweeping the Baltimore waterfront looking for their boss. It was a night shift cleaning woman, 27 years old, who had come to that address only because of a single line mistyped into a work schedule. Marisol Vega knelt down on the concrete and sawed at the rope with the dull box cutter from her supply kit, sawed until the blade snapped in two, and then she picked up a shard of broken mirror from the base of the wall and kept going. She did not know who she was saving. She only knew that he was still breathing, and that her hands still remembered the things a license revoked 4 years ago had taken away from her. When the last coil came loose, and the man pitched forward, she put out both arms and caught him. Then she saw it, lying in the corner of the basement, a silver medal torn from somebody's neck. She picked it up, wiped it on her shirt, laid it in his palm, and folded his fingers closed over it. She said one very ordinary sentence to him, the kind of thing anyone might say to a stranger. And the man this city did not dare name out loud, the man who had not let another living soul see him weaken in 25 years, began to cry, because there was no way for her to know that it was the exact last sentence his mother had ever said to him. There was one other thing Marisol Vega did not know. From the second she touched him, her name was on a list. If tonight's story reached something in you, please leave a like so we know you are still here with us. Send it along to someone you believe deserves to hear that kindness always finds its way back. And if you would like a story like this every week, subscribe to the channel. We will be waiting for you in the next one. The man's tears ran silently down both sides of his face toward his temples, without a sound to accompany them. And Marisol Vega didn't understand what had just happened, so she did the only thing she knew to do for someone in his condition, where she placed 2 fingers against his neck to find his pulse, counted silently, then lifted one of his eyelids to check his pupil. Exhaustion, severe dehydration, lips cracked into thin white lines, a pulse fast and faint as a thread pulled taut. 3 days, she thought, perhaps longer. She pulled the phone from the pocket of her uniform pants and pressed 9. His hand lunged forward before she could press 1, all 5 fingers closing around her wrist, and although his body no longer had enough strength to hold his back upright, his grip was still strong enough to make her stop. He shook his head. Only once, very slowly, but firmly. "You need a hospital," she said. "You have no idea what kind of condition you're in." He opened his mouth, and it took a long while before he managed to make a sound, and what finally came out wasn't an answer to her question. It was 3 names. Gus. He drew a breath. Priya. Stoles. She leaned back a little, leaving his hand where it was around her wrist. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He only looked at her. And there was something in that gaze that made her understand that question would never be answered in this basement. "All right," she said. "Then I'm calling the police." This time, he reacted faster than his body should still have been capable of moving. His hand tightened around her wrist again. "Don't." "Why?" He swallowed painfully against the dryness in his throat, and when he finally managed to speak, every word cost him a separate breath. "Because the person who ordered them to keep me here," he said, "will know 10 minutes before the police do." Marisol fell silent. She had worked in emergency medical services for 4 years, and she had gone to addresses where police cars arrived 20 minutes after her ambulance. She had seen enough to understand that there were cities where a statement like that wasn't the delirium of a broken mind. She looked around the basement, at the severed rope lying at the foot of the iron post, at the utility knife snapped in half beside her knee, and she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider until that moment. People didn't tie someone to an iron post in an abandoned house and leave him there for 3 days if all they meant to do was frighten him, and they didn't leave the basement door standing wide open unless they were certain no one would ever walk inside. She thought of the address written on her work schedule, the one that was supposed to belong to an office building on Light Street, and she felt a chill creep slowly up her spine from below. "Give me a phone number," she said. He recited it. 10 digits, spoken one at a time, and he had to repeat them because she entered one of the numbers incorrectly the first time. She raised the phone to her ear. It rang once. Before the second ring had ended, someone answered, and the speed of it made her understand that the man named Gus had been sitting beside the phone for the past 3 days. There was no greeting, only the deep, hoarse, fully alert voice of a man. "Who is this?" Marisol opened her mouth and realized she didn't know what to say. She didn't know the name of the man lying against her legs. She didn't know which side of anything she had stepped into. In the end, she said the only thing she knew for certain was true. "I'm the cleaner," she said. "I'm in Curtis Bay. He's alive." The other end of the line went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the man's voice spoke a single sentence, in the voice of someone who had just laid his entire life down upon a table. Don't go anywhere. 41 minutes. Marisol knew the exact number because she had checked the clock on her phone when the call ended, and looked again when she heard tires grinding over the gravel at the end of the lane. And throughout those 41 minutes, she had sat on the concrete floor with the stranger's head resting in her lap, letting a few drops of water from a bottle in her cleaning caddy fall onto his lips every 2 minutes, never allowing him to drink too much, because she knew what happened to a body that had gone 3 days without anything when it was given too much all at once. The vehicle that stopped outside was a flower delivery truck with a white cargo box and a picture of a bouquet of carnations printed on its side, the kind of vehicle no one in this city would turn around to look at twice. The first person to step out was a man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, moving quickly without making a sound, and he descended all the way into the basement before looking at her. His gaze rested on her for exactly 1/4 of a second before shifting to the man lying on the floor. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask how she had gotten inside. He knelt across from her and asked 3 questions. What's his pulse? About 130, weak and irregular. Is he conscious? Conscious and verbally responsive. But he's been growing increasingly disoriented over the past 20 minutes. Where is he bleeding? His right thigh. The bleeding has stopped, but the wound is already infected. He has a high fever, and the area around it feels much hotter than the rest of him. The man raised his head. It was the first time that night anyone had truly looked at Marisol Vega. He studied her for exactly 2 seconds, looked at the gray plastic cleaning caddy with the name of the cleaning company printed on its lid, then at the utility knife, broken in half, before saying, "I'm Gus," and nothing more. The second person to come down after him was a small woman carrying a black device as long as her hand, and she didn't look at anyone. She merely walked very slowly around the basement, passing the device along the base of the walls, over the doorframe, around the iron post, across the ceiling, and down the stairs, her eyes fixed on a row of tiny blinking lights. When she had completed a full circuit, she said only one word, "Clear." Gus gave a single nod. They placed the man on a folding plastic stretcher they had brought down from the truck. Marisol rose to her feet, and because she had stood up in rooms like this hundreds of times during her 4 years on the job, her hands went to work automatically. She picked up the broken knife, the empty water bottle, and the shard of shattered mirror, sweeping everything into her cleaning caddy. And when she noticed a small object gleaming in the crevice beside the 3rd stair, she picked it up and dropped it into the caddy with everything else without looking at it or thinking, driven by the instinct of someone whose profession was to leave nothing behind on the floor. Then she closed the lid. Somehow, Gus was already standing beside her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marisol Vega." "What company do you work for?" She told him the name of the company. He asked how she had gotten there, and she told him she had taken the number 26 bus and walked the rest of the way. He asked whether she had told anyone she was coming to this address, and she said no, because there was no one to tell. He listened to everything without writing anything down, then spoke to her in the voice of a man reading a weather report. "You have 2 choices, Miss Vega. First, you walk to the end of the road, catch a ride home, and beginning tomorrow morning, you go on living as though tonight never happened. I won't stop you, but I have to be honest with you about one thing. The people who brought him down here will come back, and when they do, they'll find the rope has been cut, and they'll look for the person who cut it. They're better at that than you think." He paused. "Second, you get in the truck." Marisol looked down at the cleaning caddy in her hand. She thought of the 3rd-floor apartment without an elevator on the west side of the city. She thought of her 22-year-old younger brother, who was probably still awake at this hour, typing lines of code on his old laptop and waiting for her to come home so he could ask whether she'd had a tiring day. If they were good at finding people, she thought, they would find that address too. "Who is he?" she asked for the 2nd time that night. Gus didn't answer. He merely stepped onto the 1st stair and looked back. Marisol lifted her cleaning caddy and followed him. 3 days before the night, Marisol Vega climbed into the flower delivery truck. The man lying on the stretcher had still been someone no one in the city of Baltimore called directly by name. People called him the boss, the Castellano family, the harbor, and when they had to mention him in a crowded restaurant, they merely tipped their chins toward the window facing the docks, and that was enough. Rafael Castellano was 34 years old, and for 8 years he had held an entire system of piers, warehouses, container fleets, and 19 companies registered under other people's names in the palm of his hand. 14 people worked in his mansion north of the city, and none of them had ever been taught anything about him. Yet all of them had learned 3 things. in the same way people learned the weather of a place, by living there long enough. The first was that he never rolled up his sleeves. Not at breakfast, not while signing papers, not in the middle of July when the heat rising from the harbor reached all the way to the rear courtyard, and every other man in the house had long since removed his jacket. His left cuff was always fastened, secured with a button, and for 7 years, the servant responsible for his laundry had received shirts whose left cuffs wore out faster than the right ones without ever once asking why. The second was that every Saturday morning at 6:30, a small truck carrying freshly baked bread stopped outside the gates to the pediatric and oncology wards of St. Agnes Hospital in the southwestern part of the city. There was enough for more than 200 people. No invoice, no business card, no sender's name. The hospital's receiving staff had sent thank you letters 3 times to the address listed on the delivery slip, and all 3 letters had been returned because the address belonged to an empty warehouse. By the 4th year, they stopped sending them, and simply accepted the bread every Saturday morning, as they had for 8 years. The third thing, and this was what the people in the house knew most clearly yet spoke of least, was that in the second drawer of the walnut desk on the 3rd floor lay an old leather-bound notebook, its spine worn smooth, about as thick as a finger. In 8 years, no one had ever seen Rafael Castellano open it in front of another person. They knew it was there because whenever he opened the drawer to look for something else, his hand always paused on the notebook's cover for exactly 1 beat before reaching for whatever he needed, and that single beat, repeated again and again across 8 years, eventually became something the entire household knew. The woman who kept the family's books was Adelaide Kerrigan, 47 years old, who had occupied the room at the end of the 2nd-floor corridor for 20 years, longer than Rafael Castellano had been in power, longer even than his father had been alive. She was the only person in the house permitted to call him by his first name. She was the one who had stood beside him at his mother's funeral, and the people in the house said that on the night of the funeral, she had sat in the hallway until morning, directly outside his bedroom door, never entering, never knocking, simply sitting there. On Tuesday afternoon, she carried a sheet of paper up to the 3rd floor and told him that the Wilmington side wanted to meet in private, with no lawyer and no one accompanying him, at a warehouse south of Curtis Bay at 9 o'clock that night. She said she had checked it 3 times. She said she didn't like it. Rafael Castellano looked at the paper, then said there were meetings that were already ruined if he brought 10 men with him, and that he would go alone. At 15 minutes before 9 on Tuesday night, he drove out through the gates. Gus Vaccaro stood on the front steps watching him leave, because it was the first time in 8 years he hadn't been allowed to go with him. Adelaide Kerrigan watched from a 2nd-floor window, and she remained there long after the car's taillights had disappeared beyond the trees. Rafael Castellano didn't return that night. He didn't return the following morning, nor did he return the day after that. At 7 o'clock Thursday morning, 34 hours after Rafael Castellano's car passed through the gates, 9 men entered the grand sitting room on the ground floor of the mansion. The youngest among them was 51 years old. The oldest was Angelo Farino, 71, who had held Rafael Castellano in his arms when the child was less than a day old, and he arrived 20 minutes before everyone else, took the chair by the window, and didn't say a word to anyone. Adelaide Kerrigan stood at the front of the room with her back to them, looking out over the front grounds, and she allowed the silence to linger a little longer than necessary, because she knew that 9 men who had lived in this world long enough all understood one thing. When someone refused to turn around, that person was about to say something that would ruin the rest of the day. She turned. Her eyes were red. When she began to speak, her voice broke on the 4th word. Then she stopped, drew a breath, and continued. And not one person in the room doubted what they were seeing, because all of them had once watched this woman sit in a hallway through an entire night outside the room of a 17-year-old boy who had just lost his mother. At 15 minutes before 9 on Tuesday night, he drove away. Alone. He was going to a warehouse south of Curtis Bay. I arranged that meeting. She let the words hang in the middle of the room. It was me. You need to hear that from my mouth before you hear it from anyone else. I checked 3 times. It was clean all 3 times, and I was wrong. No one spoke. It has been 34 hours. No call, no demand, no one asking for anything. That means this isn't about money. She gave her orders over the next 12 minutes, and she delivered them in the manner of someone who had spent 20 years reading balance sheets, which meant concisely, in order, without a single unnecessary word. Every pier was to be shut down. 36 teams, divided by district, working rotating 12-hour shifts. $400,000 in cash for anyone who brought Rafael Castellano back to this house alive. Angelo Farino was the first to rise. He made the sign of the cross and left without a word. The last man closed the door behind him at 7:32. 2 people remained in the room. Adelaide Kerrigan walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. And before speaking to the man waiting in the corner, she placed her right hand flat on the wood and tapped her ring finger against it 3 times, evenly and slowly, like someone waiting for the clock inside her mind to complete a full turn. Then she spoke, and now there wasn't a trace in her voice of the woman whose words had broken on the 4th word. "Curtis Boyle, you aren't part of those 36 teams. You're working privately for me." The man nodded. "Whoever finds him calls me first. No one else. Don't call Vaccaro. Don't call Farino. And don't call anyone wearing this family's ring. Me first. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. And send your men down there to inspect that place again." At 9:10 that morning, 2 of Curtis Boyle's men pushed open the basement door of the abandoned house in Curtis Bay. They stood at the foot of the stairs for nearly half a minute without either of them speaking. The iron post in the center of the room was empty. On the concrete floor lay loose coils of rope, their ends frayed into fine strands. They hadn't been untied. They hadn't slipped loose. They had been sawed through with something dull, an effort that must have taken a very long time. An empty water bottle rolled in the corner by the wall. There was nothing else. The floor was clean. The call reached Adelaide Kerrigan at 9:23, and she listened to the entire report without interrupting once, then placed the phone on the table and sat motionless for a very long time. It took her less than a minute to reach the only conclusion toward which everything before her appeared to point. Along the entire East Coast, there was only one person with a reason to take Rafael Castellano without demanding anything in return. Only one person patient enough to hold a card like that without revealing it, and that was Hollis Crane in Wilmington, the man who had lost 2 peers to the Castellano family 3 years earlier and had never mentioned it again. Adelaide Kerrigan rose, walked to the window, and spoke softly to herself in the voice of a woman who had just had something of her own taken away. "So he was faster than I was." Inside the truck, the first thing the small woman named Priya did was hold out her hand and say, "Phone." Marisol handed it over. Priya removed the case, took out the battery, placed all 3 items inside a thick silver fabric pouch, zipped it closed, and set it on the floor between her feet. "You can ask for it back in 6 hours. Not now." Marisol looked at the pouch. "I have one request." Both men in the front heard her, and Gus Vaccaro was the one who turned around. He had spent enough time in vehicles like this to know that the sentence that came next was almost always a number. "What are you asking for?" "Let me send my younger brother one message. Just one. I'm going to work the night shift and won't be home by tomorrow morning. He's 22 and uses a wheelchair. If morning comes and he doesn't see me, he'll try to get himself down 3 flights of stairs to look for me, and that's more dangerous than anything all of you are worried about." The truck was silent for about 3 seconds. Priya unzipped the pouch, replaced the battery, and handed the phone to Marisol. She watched Marisol type exactly 14 words, read the message through once, pressed send, and then removed the battery again. No one said anything more until the truck had crossed the bridge. But Gus Vaccaro, a man who had spent 29 years riding in vehicles that carried strangers, remembered one thing, and he remembered it the way a person remembered an unfamiliar sound coming from an engine. This woman had spent 41 minutes alone in a basement with the most powerful man on the East Coast, had learned for certain that he was important, and she hadn't asked a single question about money. The house in Dundalk stood at the end of a row of attached homes, and Marisol didn't have time to examine it closely because they carried the man through the back door and went directly to the long dining table in the middle of an inner room. The woman waiting there was 63 years old, her hair almost entirely silver, and both sleeves had already been rolled to her elbows before they arrived. She examined the right thigh once, then said without looking at anyone, "I need someone standing across from me. Anyone who can do that stays. Anyone who can't goes outside, because I don't have time to catch someone who faints." Gus looked at Marisol. Marisol removed her outer coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and walked around to the other side of the table. "Name?" "Marisol. I'm Stoles. Hold this light. Shine it where I'm looking, not where you're looking." For the next 47 minutes, Marisol Vega's 2 hands did things they hadn't been permitted to do during her 4 years on the job. They passed instruments before the doctor could call them by name, held the light steady without shifting a single degree, and counted the pulse aloud whenever the doctor needed to hear the number. 128, 121, 117. Each time the number fell, the doctor's shoulders lowered a little with it. She spoke to Marisol 3 words at a time. "Clamp. Hold it there. A little lower." At one point, she raised her head, looked at the two hands across from her, and asked, "Where did you train?" Marisol didn't answer. The doctor waited 3 seconds, then lowered her head and continued working, and she didn't ask again. When it was over, she removed her gloves, tossed them into the stainless steel basin, and washed her hands for a very long time at the kitchen sink. Then she turned and addressed the entire room, though she looked at Gus as she spoke. His fever was nearly 104 degrees. The infection had entered his bloodstream, and he had gone 3 days without water. "I'm telling you so none of you thank the wrong person." She dried her hands on a towel. 4 more hours and I wouldn't have operated. I would have washed his face. No one said anything. Marisol stood at the end of the table, her hands still stained with brown antiseptic, looking down at the man lying there. And for the first time that night, she felt her legs begin to tremble. At the exact moment everything was over, just as they always had during her 4 years on the job. They never trembled while she was working. They only trembled afterward. Gus Vaccaro pulled out a chair and placed it behind her. "Sit," he said. "Look at the floor." She sat down and looked at the floor. 30 hours after the doctor washed her hands at the kitchen sink, Rafael Castellano opened his eyes. The first thing he did wasn't ask where he was. He lay still for nearly a minute, staring at the ceiling, then turned his head very slowly to the right and took in everything he needed to see in that room before speaking a single word. Gus Vaccaro was sitting at the foot of the bed, and he had been there for 30 hours. "How long?" Rafael asked. His voice was so dry that Gus had to lean closer to hear him. "It has been 4.5 days since Tuesday night. 30 hours since we brought you here." "Tell me," Gus told him, and he spoke exactly as a soldier delivered a report, giving the bad news first. The entire city believed Rafael Castellano was missing. The docks had been closed since Thursday morning. 36 teams were searching every district in rotating 12-hour shifts. $400,000 in cash had been offered to anyone who brought him back alive. 9 capos had gathered in the grand sitting room on the ground floor at 7 o'clock Thursday morning, and the person who had summoned them, the person who had stood at the front of the room, divided the teams, read the orders, and offered the reward, was Adelaide Kerrigan. Raphael said nothing. Gus continued, telling him that she had admitted in front of all 9 men that she was the one who arranged the meeting in Curtis Bay, that she had said it before anyone had the chance to ask, and that all 9 men believed her. Gus stopped there, because that was the part where he didn't know how to continue. "Boss," he said, "I don't know whether she was involved. I only know she's the one standing at the head of the table." Rafael Castellano remained motionless for a very long time. During the 8 years he had occupied that position, he had learned something his father hadn't lived long enough to teach him. Anger was useful only when a man knew exactly where to point it, and at that moment, Rafael didn't know. The people who had taken him down into that basement had worn gloves, concealed their faces, and hadn't spoken a single word to one another throughout those 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, he had been reduced to a shadow kneeling on the concrete floor, and that shadow had been arranged to die there. "Who knows I'm alive?" he asked. "Me, Priya, Dr. Stoles." Gus paused. "And the girl?" Raphael turned his head to the left. In the corner of the room, on an old armchair placed against the wall, a woman was asleep, sitting upright with both hands resting in her lap and her chin lowered to her chest, sleeping in the manner of someone accustomed to sleeping in places never meant for sleep. The front of her shirt was still stained with brown antiseptic. He watched her a little longer than necessary. 4 people, he said. 5, including me. "Yes, boss. 5 people know. There won't be a 6th. Not tonight. Not next week. Not until I say otherwise. Not Farino. No one." He exhaled, and the next sentence cost him the entirety of that breath. "I'm dead until I say I'm not. Whoever came after me from inside my own house must be allowed to believe they finished the job, until the exact hour I choose to tell them they didn't." Gus nodded once and asked nothing more. He had seen that expression on this man's face exactly twice in 8 years, and both times it had meant a decision had been made, and no one would be permitted to bring it up for discussion again. Raphael looked toward the corner once more. "What's her name?" "Marisol Vega, 27 years old, works the night shift for a cleaning company. She went to that address because someone entered the wrong information on the work schedule. We checked." Raphael was silent. Then he asked Gus exactly one question, and it was the only question he asked about her throughout that entire morning. "Has she asked for anything yet?" "No, boss. There are nights that leave a person no choice but to become someone else by morning." The idea hadn't come from Gus Vaccaro. It had come from the man lying in the bed, and he proposed it the following afternoon in the form of a question rather than an order. "Is there anyone in my house right now who sees everything without anyone seeing them?" Gus said no. Rafael Castellano said that meant they were blind, and a blind man couldn't choose the hour to open the door. The day after that, the woman responsible for housekeeping at the mansion requested leave to care for her mother in Delaware. And it was genuine. No one had arranged it. Gus Vaquero had simply spent the past 3 days waiting for something exactly like that to happen. He submitted Marisol Vega's file through the employment agency the Castellano family had used for 11 years. The record was clean, with her real name, her real social security number, and a verifiable history of 4 uninterrupted years in professional cleaning, with no mention anywhere of the 4 years before that. On Monday morning, the car stopped about 200 yards from the mansion gates. Gus left the engine running. "You can still turn back," he said. "From here, you still can." Marisol looked at the iron fence ahead. "Does he know you're bringing me in there?" "It was his idea." "Then I'm going in." Gus tapped one finger against the steering wheel. "Listen to 3 things. First, don't go looking for anything. People don't see someone cleaning the house, but they see someone searching. Second, don't listen. This is the most important thing and the hardest, because everyone thinks listening is something the ears do, but it isn't. Listening involves the entire body. Someone who is listening slows down by half a beat, turns their head half a second too soon, and lets their hands stop working without even realizing it. People can see someone listening from the other end of a hallway. So keep cleaning. Finish the whole table. Finish the entire staircase. Don't move faster or slower, and let your ears do their work." Marisol was silent for a moment. "What's the third thing?" "If anything happens, leave through the east kitchen door, turn left, and follow the wall around the grounds. Don't run." She opened the car door. 14 people worked inside the mansion, and during her first morning, exactly 2 of them asked her name. The house manager gave her a 20-minute tour, reciting the schedule for every room, and offered only one piece of instruction. The 3rd floor was to be cleaned twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, and she wasn't to go up there on any other day. She said yes. By noon, she had understood what everyone who cleaned floors knew, and no one ever said aloud. People said everything in front of someone they regarded as furniture. During lunch, 2 men sitting in the small dining room discussed how the team in Fells Point had searched 3 entire rows of warehouses without finding anything, and they said it while she was cleaning the baseboards less than 13 feet away. Early that afternoon, a man standing in the 2nd floor hallway made a phone call and said that $400,000 could make people work harder, but it couldn't make them smarter. Then he ended the call and walked past Marisol without looking at her once. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, she was cleaning the banister of the main staircase, and at the foot of the stairs, a woman stood speaking with the house manager about ordering flowers for the grand sitting room. Marisol didn't turn her head. She continued cleaning at exactly the same pace, working from the top down, one section of the banister at a time, and she allowed her ears to do their work. Her ears told her 3 things. The woman's voice was low, slow, and entirely unhurried. She didn't ask anyone questions. She merely gave numbers. And after she left, the house manager remained at the foot of the stairs for another 4 seconds, watching her go before turning away to attend to something else. That night, in the small room reserved for staff on the lowest floor, Marisol Vega sat on the edge of the bed and studied her hands for a very long time. 11 days earlier, those hands had known nothing but cleaning cloths and disinfectant. Now they had supported a man as he collapsed forward in a basement, held a light steady for 47 minutes, and entered that same man's home to clean its stairway banister for people who believed he was dead. On her 9th day in the mansion, Marisol Vega cleaned the long table in the grand dining room, as she did every Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, which meant it was a task no one in the house had any reason to notice. She began at the end of the table nearest the window and worked her way upward, and she had cleaned about 1/3 of its surface when the door to the hallway opened. The woman who entered didn't look at her. She placed a stack of papers on the table about 10 feet from where Marisol stood, pulled out a chair, sat down, and made a phone call. Marisol didn't turn her head. She continued cleaning at the same pace, one section at a time, from left to right. The person on the other end spoke first, and continued for quite a while, and Marisol could hear the voice because there was nothing else in the room to hear. Then the voice stopped, and in the silence before the woman answered came 3 taps. Even, slow, metal against wood, 3 beats spaced exactly the same distance apart. Marisol Vega went still. The cloth in her hand stopped in the middle of the table, and she stood there without turning her head, without breathing, with not a single thought in her mind. There was only the basement in Curtis Bay, the cold concrete beneath her knees, her phone lying face down on the floor beside her with its screen still glowing, and the man resting against her legs who had begun drifting in and out of consciousness 10 minutes earlier. There were only those 41 minutes of waiting, and somewhere within those 41 minutes, though she couldn't remember exactly which minute it had been, she had called that 10-digit number again to ask how much longer they would be. The man named Gus hadn't answered immediately, and during those 3 seconds of waiting, she had heard something coming through the phone. 3 taps, even, slow, spaced exactly the same distance apart. She had thought it was water dripping somewhere in the basement. She hadn't given it another second of thought in the 9 days since. The woman sitting 10 feet away began to speak. "Listen to me, Farino. There's nothing new. I spoke with our contact in Annapolis this morning. There's nothing at all. If there were anything, you'd be the first person I called. You know that." She listened for a while longer. "No, I asked about that too. No one in Wilmington is claiming responsibility." Marisol resumed cleaning. She lifted the cloth, lowered it, and drew it from left to right, at exactly the same speed she had maintained for 9 days. Her hand performed the task entirely on its own, without needing her, and she was grateful to it for that. She cleaned the entire table. She folded the cloth, placed it in the bucket, carried the bucket out through the kitchen door, walked the length of the hallway, and descended the service stairs without taking a single step faster or slower than usual. Only when she reached the foot of the stairs did she realize she had been clenching her teeth so tightly that her jaw had begun to ache. That evening, in the small room on the lowest floor, she took a tin cookie box from her cloth bag, the box that had held every important thing in her life for the past 4 years. She opened the lid, emptied everything onto the bed, set the small cloudy yellow object apart as she always did, then turned the lid over to expose the inside. She took out a ballpoint pen and wrote on it. She didn't write a single name. She wrote the date, the time, and the 3 words, 3 tapping beats, then added another line beneath it, also with a date and a time, and that line belonged to 11 days earlier. Then she closed the lid and sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, both hands resting on the tin box, thinking about something she hadn't yet dared to consider fully. She was inside this house, sleeping beneath its roof and eating in its kitchen, and the woman who had just tapped 3 times against the dining room table 10 feet away was sleeping beneath that very same roof. 3 weeks after the night in Curtis Bay, the faucet in the ground floor laundry room began to leak, and the house manager told Marisol to use her tools and tighten the collar temporarily, because the plumber wouldn't arrive until the following Monday. Her gray plastic cleaning caddy was beneath the bed in her small room on the lowest floor, and she hadn't opened it once since that night. She crouched on the laundry room floor, lifted the lid, and searched for the screwdriver. Inside were the things her own hands had swept into it while clearing a basement: the utility knife broken in half, the empty water bottle, the shard of shattered mirror she had wrapped in a piece of newspaper. And in one corner of the caddy, mixed among several plastic ties and a roll of tape, was an object no larger than the tip of her smallest finger. Marisol picked it up and carried it into the light. It was a cufflink. It had a silver setting with a turquoise stone on its face, the cloudy kind rather than the clear kind, and 2 intertwined initials were engraved on the back, so small that she had to tilt it beneath the light to read them. She sat motionless on the laundry room floor for nearly half a minute. Then she stood, closed the caddy, and didn't repair the faucet. 3 hours later, Gus Vaccaro's car was parked behind a supermarket in Dundalk, and Marisol sat down in the passenger seat without saying anything. She merely placed the cufflink on the dashboard between them. Gus looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He sat still and stared at it for about 5 seconds, and Marisol watched his hands slowly tighten around the steering wheel. "Where did you get this?" "It was in my cleaning caddy." "I asked where you got it." "In the crevice beside the 3rd stair in the basement that night, while you were carrying him out." She continued before he could ask anything else. "I didn't look at it. I didn't think about it. Do you know what I've done for a living for the past 4 years? I pick up everything I find on the floor and put it in my caddy. I do it every day, 6 nights a week. Whenever I see something on the ground, my hand picks it up before my mind even knows it's there. If I had stopped to look at it that night, I probably would have given it to you then." Gus Vaccaro didn't answer. He picked up the cufflink, turned it over, and studied the 2 intertwined initials for a very long time. "You know who it belongs to," Marisol said. It wasn't a question. "There are 13 people in that house who have received anniversary gifts from him," Gus said. "I know every one of them. I'm the person who collected them." He placed the cufflink in his palm. "This belongs to a pair. He had them made at a shop on Charles Street 2 years ago. A gift for 20 years. He paused. "I drove him there to collect them. I waited in the car. He was inside for 20 minutes. Marisol looked straight through the windshield. "That woman told 9 men that she was the one who arranged the meeting," she said. "That's what you told me." "Yes, She said it before anyone had the chance to ask. Yes. Do you know why people do that, Mr. Vaccaro? She turned to look at him. Because when you confess the worst thing about yourself, everyone else stops searching for something worse. Gus Vaccaro sat for a very long time with the cufflink in his palm. Then he took a small plastic bag from the compartment in the car door, dropped the cufflink inside, sealed the bag, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. Don't tell anyone, he said. Not even him? Especially not him. Gus started the engine. I need 2 days. If I give this to him now, he'll believe it. He'll believe it immediately. Do you understand? And that's exactly what frightens me. For 20 years, that man has been taught that there is exactly one person in this world he never needs to question. He pulled the car away. So now I have to go and check. Once every week, on Sunday evening, Marisol Vega was given half a shift off, and Gus Vaccaro drove her back to the house in Dundalk, so Dr. Stoles could examine the man's surgical wound, and Marisol could stand there and repeat what her ears had heard during the week. On the 4th Sunday evening, after the doctor had left and Priya was still sitting in the inner room with her computer, Rafael Castellano walked out to the back steps on his own. He could walk now. He had been able to for 3 days, though he still had to place one hand against the wall every 4 steps. Marisol was sitting on the top step. He lowered himself onto the step beside her, about an arm's length away, and neither of them spoke for a long while. What are you doing out here? He asked. Sitting here until my half-hour break is over. He nodded. Then he said, I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. All right. What do you want? Marisol turned to look at him. I'm serious, he said. It has been 3 weeks, and you haven't asked me for a single thing. That makes me uncomfortable, Miss Vega. And I'll tell you honestly that it makes me more uncomfortable than the people who ask me for everything. Because with them, at least I know where I stand. He looked straight ahead into the darkness of the yard. So tell me, if it's money, name any amount. If it's a house, I have 4 registered under other people's names. Choose one. If it's medical bills, give me the number. I'll pay it all in one morning, and you'll never have to look at another collection notice for the rest of your life. Just tell me. Marisol was silent for about 5 seconds. If you could pay for any of those things, you would have already done it, wouldn't you? Yes. Then you can't pay for what I want. Tell me anyway. She looked down at her hands. I want to return to the profession they took away from me. Can you pay for that? Rafael Castellano didn't answer. He sat there for a very long time, long enough for a car to pass at the end of the street, and for the sound of its engine to fade completely away. Dr. Stoles told me about it, he said at last. She said she has practiced medicine for 40 years, and she knows what trained hands look like. She said you passed her an instrument before she could name it. Twice. 4 years, Marisol said. I worked in emergency medical services for 4 years. Ambulance, night shift, southwestern Baltimore. Then they took it away. Yes. Why? She didn't answer immediately. She straightened her back and wrapped both arms around her knees. There is a rule in my profession, she said. You aren't allowed to provide emergency care to a member of your own family. It isn't because they're cruel. It's because they know what happens to someone when the person on the stretcher is their own flesh and blood. Their hands shake. They do too much. They forget everything they were taught. She paused. I was on duty that night. My ambulance was closest to the scene, and I arrived 7 minutes before the police. The person lying in the road was my younger brother. Raphael said nothing. I knew the rule. I understood it better than anyone else working that night, and I still treated him. I performed a procedure outside the permitted protocol. I did it during the 4 minutes before the second ambulance arrived, and I did it on my own brother. She turned to look at him. He lived. That's the only thing I know for certain about any of it. Those 4 minutes kept him alive, but he couldn't walk afterward, and that was the part I couldn't save. The board didn't judge me for the part I saved. They judged me for the rule I broke. She gave a very small shrug. They read the decision in 11 minutes. Permanent revocation. I was 23. Rafael Castellano sat looking out into the dark yard. Do you resent them? No. She answered at once, without needing to think. That rule is right. It's right for everyone in the world, Mr. Castellano, except for one single night and one single person. And that night happened to fall upon me. She stood and brushed her hands against her pants. My half hour is over. She went inside. Rafael Castellano remained on the steps long after the door had closed. His left cuff buttoned as tightly as it was every day, and he said nothing to anyone about their conversation until many weeks later. The 2 days Gus Vaccaro had asked for were over, and on Wednesday morning he entered the inner room in Dundalk, placed the small plastic bag on the table in front of Rafael Castellano, then stepped back like a man who had just set down something that might explode. Rafael looked at the cuff link for about 10 seconds. He didn't pick it up. He merely said, "Priya." The small woman had been waiting 4 weeks for him to say that. She opened her computer and explained that there was something she needed to do first, something she should have done on the first day, but she hadn't dared because it required touching the system, and touching the system might leave a trace. "The warehouse south of Curtis Bay," she said. "Its main camera system was wiped clean on Wednesday morning that week. Whoever erased it did a thorough job. They even erased the access logs." She looked up. "But you have another one." Rafael Castellano looked at her. 4 years ago, when you upgraded the entire security system at the harbor, you had another device installed inside the breaker box in the northeast corner of that warehouse," Priya said. "It runs on its own battery, isn't connected to the building's network, and uploads its data to a server somewhere else once every 10 days. You told me not to tell anyone." He remained still. "Not even her?" Gus asked. "Not even her," Priya said. No one in the room spoke for a while. Priya clicked the mouse. The footage that appeared was very dark and grainy, recorded from high above, with no sound. 9:12 on Tuesday night. A car entered the lot. A man stepped out and walked into the frame from the left, alone, carrying nothing in either hand. 6 people emerged from the darkness. Priya advanced through the middle without asking anyone, and no one told her to stop. She resumed the footage at the 19th minute, when the parking lot was empty and the truck had already left, and only one person remained in the frame, standing beside a lamppost. The figure stood there for about 40 seconds, doing nothing, merely watching in the direction the truck had gone, then bent down, picked something up from the pavement, and slipped it into a coat pocket. The person was too far away for the face to be seen clearly, but the figure didn't belong to a man. Rafael Castellano still said nothing. Priya closed the footage and opened a second file, explaining that she had spent 11 nights studying it. "I needed 7 years, she said. "If I showed you only 2 years, you would see a theft. 7 years shows you a blueprint. 19 companies. Their names were the sort of names designed to make an auditor sleepy, and all of them were registered in places where paperwork could be signed by a lawyer who had never met the client. Over 7 years, $62 million had passed through them. The money emerged at the other end in accounts belonging to Hollis Crane in Wilmington, one payment at a time, arriving steadily every 10 weeks. The 10-week interval is what sent a chill down my spine," Priya said. "You audit your divisions quarterly. You audit hers once a year. She didn't choose 10 weeks because it was convenient. She chose it because it fell precisely where your eyes weren't looking." Then she told him the final part, and it wasn't in the accounting records. It was contained in 3 deleted messages she had recovered from an intermediary server, and it was so simple that it was almost beautiful. Rafael Castellano would disappear for 90 days. During those 90 days, the family's bookkeeper would run everything as acting head, and the 9 capos would gradually become accustomed to calling her, asking her permission, and waiting for her approval. At the end of 90 days, she would present the council with a proposal, and that proposal would be called a merger for lasting peace with Hollis Crane's organization. By then, the men in the room would have spent 3 months signing her papers. An entire system his grandfather had built, and his father had devoted his life to preserving, would pass into someone else's hands without a single shot being fired. Rafael Castellano sat motionless for exactly 1 hour. Gus poured him a glass of water and placed it beside his hand, but he didn't touch it. He didn't pace the room. He didn't ask another question. When the hour had passed, he raised his head. "Then we don't kill her," he said. "We take away her story." The study at the end of the second-floor hallway was cleaned at 7 o'clock on Friday evenings, after the person who used it had retired to her private room, and that rule had existed before Marisol Vega ever entered the house. At 5 minutes before 7, she stood outside the door and listened. There was no sound. She knocked twice, exactly as she had been taught on her first day, waited 3 seconds, then pushed the door open and switched on the desk lamp. She began with the bookcase against the left wall, as she did every Friday. She had been cleaning for about a minute when she heard footsteps in the hallway. They didn't belong to the house manager, whose steps were short and heavy. These were hard heels, even and slow, coming directly toward the end of the hallway. Marisol had no way out. The study had only one door, and the person approaching was about 13 feet from it. She did the only thing she could do. She kept cleaning. The door opened. Adelaide Kerrigan entered and paused for exactly 1 beat when she saw someone in the room. Then she continued to the desk and opened the drawer on the right. 7 o'clock? She said without looking up. "Yes, ma'am." Marisol continued cleaning. Adelaide searched through the drawer. From where she stood, Marisol could see the woman's right hand resting on the wooden desktop while her left hand searched. and she looked at that ring finger and kept looking until she forced herself to turn away. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am. I've been here for 5 weeks. Which days do you clean the 3rd floor?" "Tuesdays and Fridays, ma'am." "Morning or afternoon?" "Morning, ma'am. 8 o'clock on Tuesdays and 8:30 on Fridays. Because I have to receive the laundry first on Fridays." Adelaide Kerrigan raised her head. It was the first time she had looked directly into Marisol Vega's face. The look lasted about 2 seconds. Perhaps 3. And throughout those 2 or 3 seconds, Marisol did nothing except continue moving the cloth across the wood at exactly the same pace she had maintained for 5 weeks, not half a beat faster or half a beat slower. And she returned Adelaide's gaze naturally, with the expression of someone who had just been asked about her schedule and had finished answering. "The east window up there often sticks," Adelaide said. "Can you get it open?" "Yes, ma'am. You have to lift it slightly before you push." "Good." Adelaide found what she needed: a pair of folding reading glasses in a leather case. She closed the drawer and walked to the door. Then she stopped at the threshold and looked back. "What's your name?" "Marisol, ma'am." "Marisol?" She repeated it once, without any inflection, the way someone repeated a number in order to remember it. "You clean thoroughly. No one has reached the top shelf of that bookcase in 3 months." "Thank you, ma'am." She left. The sound of her heels faded along the hallway, descended the stairs, then disappeared completely. Marisol Vega stood motionless. She remained that way for about 10 seconds, then looked down at her right hand. The cleaning cloth had been twisted into a hard coil in her grip, all the water squeezed from it without her realizing, and a small puddle had gathered on the floor beside the toe of her shoe. She crouched, used the cloth to dry the puddle, then remained sitting on her heels for a long while. There was no fear in her mind. What came over her in that moment was something else, something stranger and far more unsettling. The woman who had just stood 6 feet away had asked her about a sticking window, praised the care she took with her cleaning, and asked her name, and she had done all of it in the voice of a kind person trying to make an employee feel more comfortable in a house that was still unfamiliar to her. Marisol stood and finished cleaning the bookcase. That night, in her small room on the lowest floor, she opened the tin box and added another line to the inside of the lid. She wrote the date and the time, then a short sentence. And that sentence wasn't a note about any clue. She wrote, "She remembers my face." The gardener came 3 times a week, and he was the sort of man who worked slowly but told stories quickly. On Tuesday morning, he encountered Adelaide Kerrigan on the path beside the house and spoke to her in the cheerful voice of someone sharing an amusing story. He said the new maid must have been a daydreamer, because the other day, while passing the dining room hallway window, he had seen her standing frozen in the middle of the room, cloth in hand, staring at something in the distance while her hand remained perfectly still on the table. "She must have stood like that for nearly half a minute." He laughed. He said he had been the same way when he was young, and that everyone was like that when they first started working. Adelaide Kerrigan laughed with him. She asked which day it had happened, and he had to think for a while before remembering that it was Wednesday morning, because he had arrived early that day to trim the eastern hedge. She thanked him, said she would remind the girl gently, then took out her wallet, gave him $50, and told him to buy himself a bottle of something decent. The gardener thanked her profusely and went out to the rear garden. Adelaide Kerrigan remained on the path beside the house for about a minute, both hands in the pockets of her coat, looking toward the eastern hedge without seeing anything at all. On that Wednesday morning, she had been sitting at the dining room table since 10 o'clock. She had called Angelo Farino. She had told Farino 3 things that weren't true. 11 minutes later, she went upstairs to her second-floor office, opened the bottom drawer, and removed the personnel file the employment agency sent whenever someone new was hired. She read it very slowly, because 20 years spent working with ledgers had taught her that the most important thing on a page was never written in large letters. Marisol Vega, 27 years old. 4 uninterrupted years in professional cleaning, with no gaps, working the night shift. Before that, there was nothing. Her employment history was blank from the age of 23 backward, and that was the first thing Adelaide noted. She turned to the second sheet, the employment verification from Marisol's previous company, and the agency had also included the final month's timesheet, because the agency always preferred to send too much rather than too little. She ran one finger down the address column, 23 entries. She read all 23, then read them a second time, and on the second pass, her finger stopped at the 19th line, an address in Curtis Bay. Wednesday night, Adelaide Kerrigan sat perfectly still. There was no voice inside her mind, only numbers arranging themselves in the same way they had arranged themselves for 20 years. Curtis Boyle's men had gone down there at 9:10 on Thursday morning and found the basement empty. the rope sawed through. Hollis Crane's people had arrived first. She had known that for a long time, and had lived with it for 5 weeks. But on Wednesday night, someone else had been there too. A 27-year-old woman with empty hands and a cleaning caddy, sent there because of a line on a timesheet. 3 weeks later, that same woman had applied for a job inside this house. Adelaide didn't consider the possibility that Rafael Castellano might still be alive. The thought never crossed her mind even once, because she had calculated those odds during the first week, and she had calculated them exactly 10 times in 10 different ways, with all 10 producing the same result. What she considered was something else, something far simpler and far more troublesome. That girl had gone down there, that girl had seen something, and that girl had picked something up. Adelaide Kerrigan closed the file, returned it to its exact place in the bottom drawer, and pushed the drawer shut. Then she opened the top drawer on the right, reached all the way to the back, and removed the third of 4 phones she replaced once every month. She dialed a number. She waited through 2 rings. "There is an apartment on the west side of the city," she said. "3rd floor, no elevator. I'll send the address. Find something for me about the size of the tip of a smallest finger. I'll describe it later. Search thoroughly, but don't make a mess. If anyone is home, keep them there. Don't let them call anyone. And call me. I want to question them myself." Priya Raghavan saw it before the message was even sent. For 4 weeks, she had kept a tiny trap hidden inside the mansion's system, not to listen, but simply to alert her whenever anyone opened the personnel file stored in the bottom drawer of the 2nd floor office. At 10:40 on Tuesday morning, that trap went off. Priya called Gus Vaccaro before she even had time to close her computer. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Gus Vaccaro arrived at the 3rd floor apartment, without an elevator on the west side of the city. He offered very little explanation. He told the 22-year-old man sitting in front of an old laptop that his sister was safe, that something had come up, and they needed to move him somewhere else for a few days. The young man asked whether something had happened to his sister, and Gus said no, and it was the 2nd time in his life he had lied to someone in a wheelchair. At 4:20, the car left the neighborhood. By 6 o'clock, Tobias Vega was inside a small house with a front yard in Annapolis, 25 miles away, with 2 of Gus's men sitting in a car outside and an electrical outlet where he could continue typing the unfinished lines of code on his laptop. He remained there throughout that night and knew nothing at all about what happened afterward. At 9 o'clock that evening, the lights in the apartment on the west side were on, just as they were every night. The television was playing. A coat was draped over the back of a chair. On the kitchen table sat a half-finished cup of coffee that had gone cold. Antonio, one of Gus's men, was lying in the bathtub. Gus sat inside the hallway closet. Priya was in a car parked 2 blocks away with 3 screens resting on her lap. At 11:47, the kitchen window opened from the outside. 2 people entered. The second one stepped behind the first. They moved very quietly and didn't speak a single word to each other. The first stepped across the kitchen threshold and into the hallway. The second had just brought 1 foot through the window. Both of them were inside the apartment, and that was the only thing Gus Vaccaro had been waiting for. He stepped out of the closet. Antonio emerged from the bathroom. It was over in less than 2 minutes, and during those 2 minutes, no one said a word. The first man lay on the kitchen floor with both wrists secured behind his back and a knee pressed across his spine. The second abandoned his partner, went back through the window, and descended the fire escape. Antonio pursued him as far as the top of the iron stairs, then stopped exactly where Gus had told him to stop, because some fish were far more useful when released back into the pond than lying in a basket. The man on the kitchen floor was the sort who understood very quickly which side of an exchange he was on. He began talking immediately, in the calm voice of someone calculating which piece of information would fetch the highest price. The instructions had come over the phone from an unknown number, with the caller's voice distorted by the kind of cheap software anyone could download. He had never met the client. Half of his payment had been transferred in advance to an account whose number he recited to Gus, without needing to be asked twice. The job was to find an object about the size of the tip of a smallest finger, search thoroughly without making a mess, and if anyone was home, keep them there, prevent them from calling anyone, then report back. Gus asked whether he remembered anything else. The man said there was one detail, and he offered it not because he was kind, but because he had been trained to remember such things. It was the only skill that kept someone in his profession alive for more than a few years. While I was receiving the instructions, he said, there was a sound in the background, someone tapping against wood, 3 times, evenly spaced. It wasn't a knock at the door. That sounds different. This was a finger wearing something made of metal. Gus Vaccaro straightened very slowly. He stood there looking down at the kitchen floor for a long while without speaking, then walked out onto the balcony, closed the door behind him, and called Priya. "Write it down word for word," he said. "All of it, including the part about the 3 taps. He paused. "Then call him. Now?" The other end of the line was silent for 3 seconds. "Gus," Priya said. "She's asleep inside that house." Priya called the mansion's internal line at 11:56, disguising her voice as an employee from the placement agency, and saying there were urgent documents, miss. Vega needed to sign that night. At 12:15, a car collected Marisol 200 yards from the gates, at the exact place where it had dropped her off 5 weeks earlier. During the 40-minute drive to Dundalk, the driver spoke exactly 3 sentences to her, and the third was that her brother had been safe in Annapolis since 4 o'clock that afternoon. She opened the back door of the house in Dundalk at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Rafael Castellano was standing in the hallway. He faced the door with one hand braced against the wall, and in his other hand was something she saw before she even saw his face. She stopped abruptly on the threshold. "How long have you been standing here?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Doctor." Stoles emerged from the kitchen with a towel still in her hand, and answered for him in the voice of someone who had argued for 2 hours and lost. "Since 11, I told him to sit down. He wouldn't." Marisol looked at him. 3 weeks earlier, this man had needed someone's help, merely to sit upright in bed. "Why are you standing here?" "Because I didn't know whether what happened in Locust Point was real, or whether it was meant to draw my men away from this house," he said. "If it was the second, they would come here, and they would come through this door." He placed the object in his right hand on top of the cabinet beside the wall. "Now I know it was real. You made it here." Then he sat down, a little faster than he intended, and Marisol stepped forward and caught his elbow by instinct. He didn't push her hand away. A little while later, Dr. Stoles placed 2 plates of pasta on the table and returned to the kitchen. It was the first meal Rafael and Marisol shared at the same table. Marisol ate half her plate, then set down her fork. "I want to ask you something I've been holding inside for 3 weeks. Ask. That night, why wouldn't you let me call an ambulance?" Rafael Castellano looked down at his left hand, the cuff buttoned tightly as it was every day. "You assumed it was because I was afraid someone would find out," he said. "That was partly true, but it wasn't the largest part." He paused. "When I was 17, my family had a bakery on Eastern Street. My mother opened it before I was born. One night in September, someone set it on fire. It wasn't an accident. My mother was inside, and I was in the yard behind the building." He said nothing more about that night. He merely continued. "The fire truck arrived after 19 minutes. The ambulance arrived after 26. Back then, it was the kind of neighborhood no one hurried to reach. During those 26 minutes, 4 police cars passed the end of the street without stopping. I counted them because I was sitting on the curb, and there was nothing else I could do but count." He raised his right hand to his left cuff and unfastened the button. He didn't roll up the sleeve. He merely opened the cuff and left it that way. "I tried to open the back door. It had already been hot for a long time. I've had this since that night." Marisol said nothing. "So that night in the basement, when you took out your phone to call an ambulance," he said, "I wasn't thinking about whoever was waiting to hear that I was dead. I was thinking about 26 minutes. I'm 34 years old, and I still don't trust that ambulance, Miss Vega. I know it makes no sense. I still don't trust it." He fastened his cuff again. "There's something else you don't know." "What?" "Before my mother pushed me out through the door that night, she removed the medallion from around her neck and placed it around mine. She said exactly 1 sentence to me." He raised his eyes to hers. "This is yours. Don't lose it." Marisol Vega sat perfectly still. She remembered the basement, remembered the silver object lying in the corner, remembered picking it up, wiping it against the front of her shirt, placing it in his palm, and closing his fingers around it. She even remembered the words she had spoken, the most ordinary words in the world, the kind anyone might say to a stranger. "You said those exact words to me in the basement," Rafael Castellano said. "You had no idea what you had just done to me. Some betrayals don't begin with greed. They begin with a funeral no one came to stand beside you at." 3 days after the night in Locust Point, Priya Raghavan began the most tedious work in this entire story, searching for what else those 19 companies owned besides the accounts. Houses, warehouses, vehicles. She did it because Rafael Castellano had said he didn't want to stand before the council with numbers. Numbers could be disputed. He wanted to stand before them with things that had license plates. By noon on the second day, she found a black sedan registered to a company called Harbor Line Freight, established 5 years earlier, with its insurance premiums paid regularly. She opened the insurance file and read from the bottom upward, as she always did. Then she stopped, There was one claim, she said. 4 years ago, the vehicle was reported stolen on the night of April 14th. It was recovered 3 days later in a parking lot in Halethorpe. The recorded damage was a shattered right headlight and a dented front bumper. She turned the screen toward the table. There are inspection photographs. Marisol Vega was standing at the end of the table with a glass in her hand. She set it down. She walked over, bent toward the screen, and studied the photograph for so long that Gus Vaccaro turned to look at her. Then she straightened, left the room, and was gone before anyone could ask where she was going. She returned less than a minute later carrying an old tin cookie box. She placed it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were several sheets of paper folded into quarters, a woven thread bracelet, 2 photographs, and a cloudy yellow piece of plastic, about half the size of her palm, with an edge broken into a jagged line. She placed the piece of plastic beside the screen. Priya enlarged the inspection photograph. No one in the room needed to be an expert to see it. The missing section of the right headlight in the photograph and the piece of plastic on the table shared the same fracture line, the same protruding tab at the lower corner, and the same long diagonal scratch. Rafael Castellano sat at the opposite end of the table and said nothing. "Where did you get it?" Priya asked very softly. "On Wilkins Road, on the night of April 14th, 4 years ago," Marisol said. "I was the first person to reach the scene. My ambulance arrived 7 minutes before the police." She looked down at the piece of plastic. "During those 7 minutes, I did my job. But there was a moment after the second ambulance arrived when they pushed me away because I was no longer permitted to be there, and I turned back and saw this piece lying about 13 feet from where my brother had been. I picked it up and put it in my pocket. I didn't think about it. I only thought that the car was gone, and this was the only thing it had left behind." She paused. 3 weeks later, I requested a copy of the scene report. Under evidence recovered at the scene, they wrote one line: "No vehicle fragments recovered." The case was closed after 4 months. They never found the car. They never found the driver. No one in the room spoke for a very long time. Marisol turned toward Rafael Castellano. "That company belongs to you." "Yes," he said. His voice was entirely ordinary, and that ordinariness was more frightening than anything else. "Who was driving that car, Mr. Castellano?" He didn't answer immediately. He rose from his chair, walked 3 steps to the window, then stopped with his back to the room. "On the night of April 14th, he said. "She called me at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. She said the Harbor Line car had been stolen from the southern lot. She said she had parked it there that afternoon." He paused. "I asked whether she was all right. She said she was. I told her to go to sleep, and that I would deal with it in the morning." Gus Vaccaro closed his eyes. "The next morning, I had my people report the car stolen," Rafael said. "It was recovered 3 days later. I looked at the inspection photograph exactly once, saw the shattered headlight, and signed an order to dispose of the matter quietly, so it wouldn't be tied to the company's name. I signed it in 40 seconds while eating breakfast." He turned around. "April 14th is the anniversary of her son's death." He looked at Marisol Vega, and he looked at her for a very long time. "You asked whether I could give you back your profession," he said. "That night, a woman drove away to deliver money when she was in no condition to drive, and I was the one who believed her when she called me at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was the one who signed the paper that ensured no one would search for that car again for the next 4 years. He placed one hand on the back of the chair. "You didn't lose your profession because you saved your brother. You lost it because that night, it was lying on the road, and it was lying there because I signed a piece of paper in 40 seconds. The call reached Adelaide Kerrigan at 3:40 on Wednesday morning, and she had been awake for a long time. The person on the other end spoke for 11 seconds. One man had been captured. One had escaped. They had found nothing. That group wouldn't make a second attempt, because a second attempt would leave a trail broad enough for someone to follow on foot." She set down the phone and sat in the darkness. She didn't feel afraid. What she felt was something else. Something 20 years spent working with numbers had taught her to recognize the instant it appeared. It was the feeling of a spreadsheet beginning to fall out of balance when she still didn't know which line contained the error. She found 3 possible explanations for what had happened that night. The first was that the girl had discovered something and found someone to protect her. The second was that Hollis Crane's people were watching Adelaide and had arrived first to secure whatever she was trying to find. The third was coincidence, a trap prepared for someone else that her men had stumbled into by accident. She turned all 3 possibilities over in her mind for 2 hours, and by 5:30 that morning, she realized they all told her exactly the same thing, and it had nothing to do with which explanation was correct. She no longer had time to be patient. At 9 o'clock, she called Angelo Fiorino. She told him it had been 6 weeks without news, demands, or a single trace. that a family couldn't continue indefinitely under an acting head, and that the time had come to do what none of them wanted to do. A full council. 3:00 Sunday afternoon in the Great Hall. Every capo and everyone entitled to vote. The election of an official successor. Angelo Farino listened to everything. Then he said, "I'll be there, Adelaide." He ended the call and remained seated for a full minute, with his hand still resting on the receiver. At 3:00 that afternoon, Gus Vaccaro's car stopped outside Angelo Farino's house, and the 71-year-old man climbed into the back seat without asking a single question. They entered the house in Dundalk through the rear door. Farino stepped into the inner room and saw the man standing in its center, leaning against the back of a chair. He didn't say a word. He didn't cry out. He walked forward slowly, taking 3 steps, then lowered himself to his knees on the wooden floor, took Rafael Castellano's right hand, and pressed his forehead against the back of it. He remained that way for a long time. Rafael Castellano stood still, feeling the wet warmth of a 71-year-old man's tears against the back of his hand. And for the first time in 6 weeks, he felt something close to coming home. Gus brought 2 other capos to a different location over the next 2 days, and they weren't allowed to see anyone. They were merely asked a few ordinary questions about Sunday's meeting. Who would sit where? Who would speak first? Who had received a phone call first? And who had been called afterward? Both answered smoothly, without stumbling once, with the practiced composure of men who had taken seats at another table long ago. Rafael Castellano sat in the adjoining room wearing a small earpiece, and said nothing throughout either conversation. When it was over, he opened the leather-bound notebook and wrote both men's names inside, 1 name on each line, and it was the first time in 8 years anyone had seen him open that notebook in front of another person. By Saturday night, everything had been arranged in a stack on the dining table in Dundalk. 7 years of accounting records printed on paper, with every 10-week interval marked in red ink, a memory card containing the footage from the breaker box in the northeast corner of the warehouse, a small plastic bag holding the cufflink with the turquoise stone, 2 signed statements, notarized on Saturday afternoon by a lawyer Raphael's grandfather had trusted 40 years earlier, a recording lasting 2 minutes and 19 seconds, 11 seconds of which contained a man recounting that he had heard 3 evenly spaced taps against a wooden surface. Rafael Castellano placed each item inside his father's old leather briefcase, closed its 2 brass clasps, and set it on the floor beside the leg of his chair. The great hall of the Castellano mansion could hold 60 people, and that Sunday afternoon, 38 people sat along the long walnut table in order of seniority, each with a crystal glass to the right and a packet of documents to the left. Along the 2 walls stood 22 members of the household security detail, hands clasped in front of them, their faces expressionless. The 2 oak doors at the far end of the room had been closed since 2:45. Adelaide Kerrigan stood at the head of the table. She wore dark clothing. In her right hand was a glass of wine, held level with her chest but not raised. She waited for the scraping of chairs to cease, waited another 3 seconds after the room had fallen silent, then began. She had written the opening on paper and read it 19 times over 4 days, and she knew it so thoroughly that she could place the emphasis exactly where she intended. "Gentlemen," she said, "6 weeks ago this house lost the man who taught most of us what the word family means." She paused for exactly half a beat where she had planned to pause. "We don't know what happened to him. We may never know. But I know one thing, and I believe all of you know it too. If Raphael were still sitting in that chair, he wouldn't allow us to remain motionless for 1 more day." She drew breath to deliver the 4th sentence. At the far end of the room, the 2 oak doors began to open. They didn't burst apart. They didn't strike the walls. They opened inward, slowly and evenly, without making a sound. Because the previous night, Gus Vaccaro had oiled all 4 hinges for precisely that reason. 38 heads turned at once. Rafael Castellano walked in. He carried no weapon. He wore no armor. He was dressed in a white shirt, his left cuff buttoned tightly as it was every day, and in his right hand he carried an old brown leather briefcase, the only thing he brought into the room. 3 steps behind him were Gus Vaccaro and Priya Raghavan. The sound that passed through the room at that moment wasn't a sound. It was the absence of one. 38 men inhaled at the same time, and then no one exhaled. No one rose. No one cried out. A man near the middle of the table dropped his pen onto the wood, and the sound was so loud that half the room flinched. Angelo Farino, seated in the second chair on the left, lowered his head and didn't raise it again. Adelaide Kerrigan didn't move. She remained at the head of the table with the wine glass still level with her chest, and she stood that way for 6 seconds. Her face didn't change. Her shoulders neither fell nor rose. Her mouth still held the shape of someone about to speak a 4th sentence. During those 6 seconds, the only thing moving in the entire room was the crystal glass in her right hand. It began to tremble, so slightly that no one at a distance could see it, but enough to send a ripple across the wine until it touched the rim. One drop spilled over. It ran down the bowl of the glass, traveled the entire length of the stem, then fell onto the white tablecloth. It spread into a dark circle the size of a coin. Rafael Castellano walked the full length of the great hall, neither quickly nor slowly, without looking at any of the 38 men. He stopped beside the third empty chair from the head of the table. He placed the leather briefcase on the tabletop. He opened the 2 brass clasps, one at a time, and in the silent room, both clicks sounded perfectly clear. Then he raised his head and spoke in a voice no louder than someone ordering a meal. "Sit down, Adelaide." Without being told, the 3 most senior capos rose from their chairs and walked toward the oak doors at the far end of the room. They stopped there, facing inward, their hands clasped in front of them. There was no monster in that room. There were only 38 men who had just been forced to remember which side of the table they were sitting on. Adelaide Kerrigan sat down. Priya Raghavan connected a cable to the projector concealed in the ceiling, and the wall behind the head of the table lit up. The first image was dark and grainy, filmed from high above an empty parking lot, showing a person standing beside a lamppost, bending to pick something up from the pavement, and slipping it into a coat pocket. The second was a statement bearing the name Harborline Freight at the top, with one line marked in red, showing a transfer of $2,300,000 made 3 weeks before September 14th. The third was a long table crowded with text, covering 7 years, 19 company names, and payments repeating regularly every 10 weeks, like the breathing of someone asleep. The fourth was the voice of a man recounting that he had been hired to enter a third-floor apartment and find an object the size of the tip of a smallest finger. Adelaide Kerrigan listened to all of it. Then she rose and began to speak, and she spoke exceptionally well. She said the 19 companies had been established by her department, but Curtis Boyle managed their daily operations, and she offered dates, reference numbers, and the names of bank branches, the sort of details only someone who had truly done the work for 20 years could recite with such ease. She said she had been suspicious since spring, that she had secretly retained copies of certain documents, and she said it while looking directly at Angelo Farino, because she knew precisely which man in that room could make 10 others believe her if he believed her first. She spoke for 4 minutes. Near the middle of the room, 2 capos began to nod. Then the side door on the left of the great hall opened. The person who entered was a woman wearing the gray uniform of the household staff, her hair tied neatly behind her, carrying nothing in either hand except an old tin cookie box. 38 heads turned for the second time that afternoon, and this time, no one understood what they were seeing. Marisol Vega walked the full length of the great hall. She moved slowly and evenly, without looking at anyone, and although 22 armed men stood along the walls, not one of them moved because Rafael Castellano stood at the head of the table and made no gesture to stop her. She halted at the head of the table, about an arm's length from Adelaide Kerrigan. She opened the tin box, removed a cloudy yellow piece of plastic half the size of her palm, and placed it on the table before Adelaide, directly beside the dark circle the drop of wine had left on the white tablecloth. "You don't remember me," she said, "but I remember your headlight." Adelaide Kerrigan looked down at the piece of plastic. She didn't pick it up. She studied it for about 2 seconds, and during those 2 seconds, the woman who had spent the previous 4 minutes speaking as smoothly as flowing water vanished from her face. "The night of April 14th, 4 years ago, on Wilkins Road," Marisol said. "I was the first emergency medical worker to reach the scene. I arrived 7 minutes before the police. The person lying in the road that night was my younger brother. He was 18, and he hasn't been able to walk since that night. I picked up this piece before anyone else arrived, and I kept it for 4 years because the report contained a single line stating that no vehicle fragments had been recovered." She never raised her voice. "The vehicle that night was registered to Harborline Freight. It was reported stolen at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning by you, over the phone. 3 days later, it was found in a parking lot in Halethorpe, with its right headlight shattered." Marisol pushed the tin box aside. "April 14th is the anniversary of your son's death. I learned that last week, and I thought about it, ma'am. I thought about it for 7 nights." She looked directly into the woman's face. "But I have also spent the past 4 years in a third-floor apartment without an elevator with someone who needs me to carry him downstairs whenever he wants to leave home. So I'm going to ask you only one question. That night, when you drove away from there, did you look in the rearview mirror?" Adelaide Kerrigan opened her mouth. Before the first sound could emerge, her right hand lifted from the table and descended, her ring finger tapping the wood 3 times, evenly and slowly, each beat separated by exactly the same interval. The great hall was so silent that the 3 taps traveled the full length of the room and echoed from the far wall. Angelo Fiorino raised his head very slowly. Without saying anything, Priya Raghavan reached out and replayed the final 11 seconds of the recording, and the man's voice came through the speakers, saying he had heard 3 evenly spaced taps against wood, made by a finger wearing something metal. The entire room heard those 2 sounds less than 8 seconds apart. No one needed another explanation. Adelaide Kerrigan left the great hall through the side door, and not one of the 38 people seated at the table rose to stop her. The 3 capos standing by the oak doors looked at Rafael Castellano, and Rafael Castellano shook his head once. She crossed the rear courtyard, passed the driveway, went out through the eastern gate, and walked directly toward the warehouse district at the end of the road, where a long wooden pier extended into the water. At berth 7, a boat had been fully fueled the week before, registered under the name of a company in Delaware, with its papers waiting inside the cabin. She didn't run. She had never run in her life. Rafael Castellano followed her on foot, alone, carrying nothing in his hands. He moved far more slowly than she did, because his left shoulder still had to remain motionless, and it took him nearly 4 minutes to walk the length of the pier. But he didn't need to hurry, because there was nowhere left to go at the end. She stopped about 10 feet from the boat. She stood with her back to the water and waited for him to reach her. "You didn't bring a gun," she said. "No. Where is Vaccaro?" "At the beginning of the pier. I told him to stay there." Adelaide Kerrigan looked at him for a long time. Wind from the harbor swept through the space between them. "Aren't you going to ask me why?" "No," he said. "I'm going to stand here and listen." She gave a short laugh with nothing in it. "Sean Kerrigan," she said, 26 years old. 6 years ago, the shipment at Sparrow's Point." Rafael Castellano said nothing. "You signed the order for that shipment to leave on the night of March 11th. I told you to postpone it. I told you twice, once in your office and once in the car. You said postponing it would cost us the berth." She drew a breath. "I buried him on the 15th. You weren't there, Raphael. I was in Philadelphia. I know where you were." She said it in an entirely ordinary voice. 11 people came that day. I counted them. I stood there and counted, just as you sat on the curb, and counted 4 police cars passing the end of Eastern Street. Rafael Castellano remained still. 6 years, she said. "You thought this began with money. It didn't. Money was only the shovel." He allowed the silence to rest between them for a while. Then he reached into his coat pocket, removed something, and extended it toward her in his open palm. It was a silver medallion, its face almost completely worn away, its chain broken and repaired with a new ring. "You placed this around my neck at my mother's funeral," he said. "I was 17, and I can't remember anything anyone said to me that day. But I remember this. You stood behind me in the church, slipped the chain over my head, and didn't say a single word." She looked at the medallion but didn't take it. "I know you sat outside my room that night," he said. "Everyone in the house knows. For 20 years. No one has mentioned it to me even once. But I know." He closed his hand. "I won't end this the way my father would have." Adelaide Kerrigan stood at the end of the pier and said nothing more. At the beginning of the pier behind them, Gus Vaccaro had raised his phone. He turned his back and lowered his voice. But Rafael Castellano had listened to this man make calls for 8 years, and immediately recognized the sequence of numbers being dialed. It wasn't the number of anyone in the family. It was a number that ended at the switchboard of the federal office in Baltimore. 7 minutes later, when it was over, and Adelaide had left the pier with people wearing dark coats, Gus Vaccaro walked over and stood beside him. He looked out across the water. "Boss," he said, "why do it this way?" Rafael Castellano didn't turn his head. "Because I grew up in a world where everything ends beneath the water," he said. "I don't want her to live in that world." Gus Vaccaro nodded once and asked nothing more. The exposure of the cover-up set something in motion that no one in the Castellano family had anticipated. The file of an accident case closed 4 years earlier was pulled from the archives. Once it became known that the car had never been stolen, and that the line in the report stating no vehicle fragments had been recovered was false, everything resting behind it began to tremble as well. 11 months later, the Maryland State Medical Board reconsidered its decision to revoke Marisol Vega's certification, and it took them 8 weeks to produce a document less than a page long. She received it on a Thursday afternoon. She walked out to the parking lot, sat in the driver's seat, placed the paper on her lap, and remained there for 20 minutes without starting the engine. She was 29 years old. She had been 23 on the day they read the old decision in 11 minutes. 2 years after that Sunday afternoon in the Great Hall, the bakery reopened on Eastern Street, at the exact same address and under the exact same name, the name Rafael Castellano's mother had painted on the wooden sign before he was born. During those 2 years, the network of piers, warehouses, and container fleets had been dismantled one piece at a time. Whatever could be sold was sold. Whatever had to be surrendered was surrendered, and the money was moved into places where it could sleep peacefully at night. The bread truck still arrived at St. Agnes Hospital at 6:30 every Saturday morning, still carrying enough for more than 200 people. The only difference was that the bakery's name now appeared on the side of the truck. On opening morning, about 40 strangers filled the bakery. Tobias Vega, 24 years old, stood at one end of the pastry counter with his walking frame and made his way along its entire length, 11 steps. He stopped 3 times along the way, but he didn't sit down once. No one applauded because Marisol had asked them beforehand not to. They simply stood and watched, and several people turned their faces away for a while. Rafael Castellano stood behind the counter in front of 40 strangers and rolled his left sleeve all the way to his elbow to knead the dough. The scar running along his forearm lay exposed beneath the light, concealed by nothing at all. Throughout that entire morning, no one asked him a single question about it. Near the end of the day, when most of the customers had gone, he walked over to where Tobias was resting in a chair beside the window. He reached behind his neck, removed the silver medallion whose face had been worn almost smooth, and lowered the chain over the young man's head in exactly the same way someone had once done for him in a church many years earlier. Then he said exactly one sentence to him: "This is yours. Don't lose it." Marisol Vega stood at the back door watching, both hands still dusted with flour, and she didn't step forward. She remained there until the 2 men had finished speaking. Perhaps tonight's story leaves us with something very simple. The person who saves us isn't always the strongest person in the room. Sometimes it is merely someone accustomed to kneeling to clean a floor. So when another person falls, they are already in a position to reach out a hand. Kindness is never lost. It simply travels a very long road before returning to knock on our own door. There are acts of kindness we offer to strangers without ever knowing where they will lead, just as there are ordinary words that fall into the deepest place in someone's heart without us ever realizing it. We don't know what tonight's story may have touched inside you, or which moment among everything you have just heard will remain with you the longest. Please leave a comment below, because we read every line you send us, and truly hope to hear the feelings from the depths of your heart. If this story warmed your heart, please press the like button and share it with someone who believes, as you do, that kindness always finds its way back. And please subscribe to our channel so that each day, more compelling stories can find their way to you. We wish everyone listening to this video abundant health, a life filled with happiness and peace each day, gentle mornings, and a warm home to return to at the end of every afternoon. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.